there's no time like the present to get into our big keynote for the day. And I want to welcome to the stage. Oh, I've switched rooms. This is a little more casual for this conversation. Let's welcome to the stage David. David, how are you? Oh, you're coming to us inside a black hole, I see. So how is the void is treating you well?
It's treating me very well. Yes. Thank you for having me back.
Mm, of course. I was just thinking earlier about us doing this over Skype, which we did for 2020, and it's been quite a year. How have you held up over the year?
I think trying to summarize the entire year in a binary statement
We
like
can
that
skip
is
it. We can skip it
impossible.
for sure.
This is a quantum statement of four simultaneous states throughout the years or year bouncing back and forth between them. Yeah, it's
Yep.
been wild. Let's
Uh,
just let's say that.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Well, with that, let's jump into the questions that I've got. I'm going to do a thing. It's a little dangerous, which is I'm going to say, if you have a question for David, you can put it in Discord, but I'm not necessarily going to read them all. So you need to be diligent, express it well so that I can see it and know it. And here, I'll put a message in Discord right now and you can do it as replies. So here, questions for David. So you can do a reply off that in Discord. I will check it if we have time. No promises. Okay, great. Now let's get into it. Well, this time last year, we were talking about the Hey.com launch, which it seems like it's gone well. Congratulations. I thought we would kind of talk a little bit about that as well today. Has it, first of all, I guess just the boilerplate here. Did it go as well as it seemed like it went?
Well, how did it seem? I mean, I
It
recall
seemed like
actually
great.
I
Well, I mean,
recall 2 weeks of utter hell actually when we first
well,
launched
we
it.
will. I have on here discussions of Apple, which we
Yeah,
can get into as well.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll just keep it. Yeah, it started badly, but it turned out
Okay.
well. I let's
Well,
just.
you.
I mean, I think it didn't start in any way like we thought it would have. But where it
Okay.
turned out, I'm really pleased.
Yeah.
Both in terms of just kind of you work on something. I've worked on Hey for about 2 years when we hit Let's Go, and written thousands and thousands of lines of code, done all sorts of preparations and tests and whatever. Are we ready to launch an email service? I mean, it's funny because I was asked on an interview back in, I think, 2011 or 12 or something by no other than Jason Calcanis saying like, "Oh, haha, the Basecamp. So when are you going to take on some real competition like Gmail?"
Like, geez.
And and I was laughing at the time, just going like, "Ha ha ha! I'd never want to take on Gmail. I mean, who would be insane enough to want to do that?" Um, and here we are, like, what is that, 8 or 9 years later, literally taking on Gmail, trying to do
Yeah.
email, which is by far and away the hardest thing we've ever tried to do at Basecamp by at least an order of magnitude in terms of the criticality, mainly of the service. I mean,
Yeah.
with Basecamp, you store a lot of business data, and if you go down, someone can't get to their PowerPoint presentation about the quarterly earnings or something like that. You're like, meh. Like your
Yeah.
email service goes down, and like people can't get to their flight tickets and board their plane. They can't get their notifications from a doctor. Like the criticality is about as high as it gets in
Yeah.
communication. I mean, I'd actually
Hmm.
say higher than any other form of messaging systems, for example, right? Like your email address really just is that super high
Hmm.
criticality, which just placed everything on just this dramatically different level where we went like, geez, ugh, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I mean, I've been making information systems for 20 years, but email, and not an email
Yeah.
client, right? Like email clients, there's been tons of
Yeah.
those. And that's great. It's great to have diversity in that. But when you let someone else handle the service, there's always the backup, right? Like say your client crashes, okay, someone can just log into Gmail and then get to their email. Versus
Yeah.
when you're actually handling the email as a service, that's just a
Yeah.
new level of criticality. But
Yeah.
also, what's so wonderful about that is it's a new challenge and it's brought all these things to Rails. Like literally, just I
Yeah.
think yesterday or 2 days ago, we merged active record encryption.
Yeah.
Um,
I saw that. That was
Jorge,
great. Yeah.
had not only done all that work in Basecamp in Hey over several months during the development of it, but also shined it up, and now it's going to be in Rails. So like something
Yeah.
we literally spent months and months off. We hired different security firms to vet the approach to make sure that like it was proper encryption tech and approach such that it was good. Like we can put that into Rails, and then someone else can take that and just like, oh, we can essentially have that level of security in our app with a few DSL lines. I mean, that's
That's
what's
great.
so fun to me about creating something like Hey that's just completely different category of thing,
Hmm.
completely different level of new criticality, is that it requires new solutions that we haven't had to deal with before, which arrives at this place where I get to do some of my favorite things, which is to write some code to solve a real problem and then extract that code and put it into Rails.
Absolutely. I think you hit on a great piece, which I had next on my list, which is, email. You hit the nail on the head in that the information architectures you've worked on in the past they have the common nouns and verbs to them. You've got things and you've got this and you've got that.
Right.
And so those things come very easy and naturally to you and to the team. Email is a whole different ball game in some ways, and so I'm wondering if there's any, like, thinking about the architecture for that service. It had to look different than the architecture for the other services. I'm wondering if you could speak about just briefly, like, is there any really interesting bits? Like, I personally am wondering if you wrote an email server in Ruby, for instance, right? But that's just my weirdness. But I'm wondering, like, that sort of thing is just different enough from the other stuff you've done.
It's funny you should mention that. We haven't even announced it, but we are actually working on an email servers in Ruby.
We did not plan this. We did not plan
this
this.
this is just a pre-announcement teaser, no even name, even though we do have an internal name for it. We're not currently actually running that, but what we've came to the realization with is if you're going to run an email server, it's kind of like, I think it's the old Alan Kay quote: "If you're serious about software, you have to build your own hardware." If you're serious about being an email service, you essentially have to build your own email server. And that is essentially what we've started to do in all the ways, right? Action Mailbox came straight out of Hey. Before we even launched Hey, I think we put it into Rails because it was one of the first things we started working on. And that kind of falls into that category. But on the easier side, now we're also working directly on the mail server itself so that we can do more things and make tighter integrations than what Postfix allows us to do. We use Postfix. So in
Hmm.
some ways, I mean, what gave us the hubris to think we could do email is that Basecamp has been sending 5 million emails a day for quite a long time. So
Sure.
the
Yeah.
volume of email we've been sending is like, okay, actually Basecamp is already way above what we're going to have, presumably
Yeah.
for quite a while. Like to send 5 million emails out of a service where people have to write those emails, like you got to have quite
Yeah.
some
It's so
scale.
different, right? But on the other hand, you really have to be sure they get delivered. Whereas the Basecamp
Yes,
ones, yeah, like you want to be sure they get delivered, but
right.
if they bounce and you have to deliver them 6 hours later, that's not the end of the world either.
And that was one of those things where the criticality was just really high, where email just has so much history. There's so many RFCs and protocols and DKIM this and that
Oh,
that you have to figure out to do deliverability. In a way, I actually think is kind of sad. Like I'm
yeah.
disappointed it's that hard. Like, Hey, is a kind of problem where I'm like, this we couldn't have done this with the original team. Like 4 people starting Basecamp back in 2004 could totally do Basecamp. Like Basecamp was a reasonable thing to start with 4 people. Doing Hey was not a reasonable thing. You can't do that with 4 people.
Yeah.
You can barely hold the whole problem space in your mind at the same time because it's just so
Yeah.
much. Um, so it was really something where I felt like we needed to be at the place where we were. 20 years of experience building
Yeah.
information systems, sending all these millions of emails every day. So we knew all the things about like warming IPs and how to get through and all that other stuff, right? Like how to
Yeah.
even validate whether what you're building is working, right? Um, and I think that sort of gave us the confidence to do it. And then yet still, I've been actually surprised at how difficult it's been, right? Like
Yeah.
how difficult, as in like just so many things where you go into a thing like, wow, there's a lot here, right? And then you go into it and then it's like, oh shit, there's even more. And then also some of it was we just invited sort of I don't want to say pain and suffering, but we try to play the game at a hard level in certain ways, like 2FA. Hey is
Mm,
the only major email system that I know of that literally requires 2FA for all its paying
yeah,
customers. And
I'm
do you know
sure.
why people don't do that? Because it's really difficult. Like there's a
Yeah,
reason
the
why the
conversion
general
rate
adoption.
must be terrible. Yeah.
It's interesting. The conversion rate hasn't suffered so much, but you get
Oh,
to
good.
suffer all the usability issues with 2FA.
Mm.
Oh, what happens if I get a new phone? What happens if I there's just so
Oh,
many questions
yes.
to answer and figure out, and like how do you actually verify someone's identity in depth such that you're not open to identity theft and so on. It's
Yep.
just a level of criticality and issues that is really fascinating. But I mean, that was also one of
Yeah.
those things I thought like, do you know what? I've written Basecamp 3 times. I
Right.
kind of know the domain now, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
uh, not that we can't come up with new things, and we're working on Basecamp 4, and like that's going to be great. But like, that was very within my comfort zone. Um,
Yep.
he felt totally at that level where you kind of you have to reach. Like, you're not
Yep.
sure how you're going to do it all. I wasn't sure how I was going to do all the architecture for it. I wasn't sure how I was going to do all the modeling, even just the volume of data, right? So Basecamp
Yeah.
gets a huge amount of data, and we're dealing with, I don't know, terabytes of data. But you know how quickly you accumulate a terabyte of data with email? In about like 5 seconds and 2 users,
Yeah, the
right?
receive side is so insane. Yeah.
It's bananas, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just bananas. We're getting so much email in, and like you got to store it, you got to parse it, you got to strip it of spy pixels, you got to do all these things, and the volume is just so high
Yeah.
because it's not just humans, right? Like it's not just like, oh, one person on Basecamp posting a comment on something. It is
Yeah.
literally like, oh, this person gets 1,000 emails a day, and like they're full of stuff, and no one follows any fucking standards. So you got to,
No.
it's almost like writing a browser to some extent, right? Where you're
Yeah.
like, oh man, if I could just sit down and implement the HTML specification, that can't be so hard, can it? And then you're like, oh, actually, it's pretty hard and takes about 20 years to get all the corner cases right. Um,
Yeah.
so
I mean, it's
there's
so
been a lot of
it's
that.
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, the evolution of email specifically, and that you can't really leave anything out if you want to implement it in the same
Right.
way for the browser. Like, yeah, like maybe you could leave out the blink tag now, but you still have to parse it, right? You still have to know, for
Yes.
instance, like I'm not
Yes.
doing it to the blink tag, right? But for
Yes.
email, like, yeah, email went through this transition in the early 2000s when spam was just so hot and heavy, where they're like, you know
Right.
what? Let's layer in about 6 competing protocols on top of each
Yes.
other and
Yes.
orthogonal in order to
Right.
manage the spam load, DKIM and all kinds of
Right.
stuff that basically are like, if you want to implement it now, you're like, oh, well, that person can't send you an email because you don't implement the right version of DKIM that the sender requires for you to receive the email. Yeah, I've,
And
uh,
at the same time, it's also what's beautiful about it. It was not designed by a committee, right? Like it's the
right.
classic worse is better. Is the
Hmm.
classic worse is better is that like, oh, what a bunch of scientists sat down and did in, I think what 78 or something was the first email
Yeah.
sender. What that say sat down and what they did, like what got us here, which is the same thing with HTML. Why I love HTML so much is um I've been getting into sort of a little bit of video games and like backwards compatibility. Like the PlayStation 5 can't even play PlayStation 3 games. Like you literally
Right.
lost backwards compatibility over
Hmm.
a course of like 5 years. A
Yep.
modern browser can literally run the first website that was ever published, and it'll look like the first website that was ever published. The one
Yeah.
exception to that is, I mean, Steve Jobs killed the Flash, and that was actually
Sure.
in some ways it was a benefit to the world. In other ways, it was a real tragedy.
Right.
It is a real tragedy for that promise that what you build now is still going to run on a browser like 50 years from now. Um, and I think there's a deep sense of beauty in that, and deep sense of beauty in no one was in control. No one could just
Right.
say, "Hey, email is going to be like this." No, no, no. You had to have consensus. You had to have
Yeah.
RFCs, and people would argue, and they would implement them differently. So you had to be very tolerant in what you take in, and strict in what you send out, and like all these emergent properties of the ecosystem that is email. I mean, I we build Hey because we're huge fans of emails, right? Like I'm huge fans of the protocols, not the platforms, of this
Sure.
interoperability and all these things.
Yeah.
But like in some ways, like the weirdness, the corner cases of it all just made me love email even more. Like it's such a unique thing. Email would never work today. You would never be allowed to launch
Oh,
email today, right? Like it never would
yeah.
happen. Someone would go like, "Hey, that's a platform. I can monetize that platform, and I can make sure it doesn't run on these other services, or I'll send a crappier version, or I'll do all these other things where you could never get what we have with email today, which is you got to just look back on it like, you know what? This is a fucking treasure. We gotta take care of the treasure. We gotta dust it off. We gotta modernize it. We gotta keep it with the
Yep.
times. We gotta keep making it better while still honoring the fact that this fucking thing has been around since '78 and it still
Yeah.
damn works. Amazing.
Yeah. I think I always, people are always trying to say like, oh well, this thing, this service, this usually it's a service is like, oh, it's
Right.
gonna get rid of email. We can name 3 or 4 off the top of our heads if we wanted to.
Right.
But I think what's most interesting is that their lack of ability to do that doesn't speak to their inability to execute, because those teams can execute at a very high level. It actually speaks
Yes.
specifically to the utility of email and the simplicity in which the thing is just like, I need to send a structured message to another human, and it needs to basically be delivered in a reasonable amount of time. And I don't need a jillion other things. And
Right.
that utility is just so difficult to replicate when you already have so everybody has email addresses and all that kind of stuff. It's like there's so much movement in that direction. Anyway, one thing talking about Flash, I wanted to say was, I don't know if you've seen that there's a bunch of Flash to HTML JavaScript converters now. So I actually think that browsers have gotten fast enough and computers have gotten fast enough that Flash games are going to make a comeback via on-demand conversion. So people are going to be like, hey, like, you want to play all those old Flash games? Great. You can just play them in your browser, and they're just getting converted to HTML and JavaScript.
Oh,
and you're
that's
just playing
great.
them now. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, that was what I was just saying about like getting into video games. Is specifically I was getting into retro gaming, and this idea that you today can buy like a Raspberry Pi thing that's like, I don't know, $50 or something, and it runs like all the Super Nintendo games, and it runs all the Nintendo games, and like that whole history of computing and of gaming is preserved because we can bring it forward, and that's really just something that's very special. That history just doesn't go to die, right? Like that brings a warmth to my heart that's happening with Flash as well.
That's a good. Actually, this is a good IP discussion, because I think that the thing I have interests, I have problems with. I love retro gaming as well, but my issue is that the IP that gets locked up in those games and the inability for people to find them. Like, you can go find a bunch of ROMs for Zelda games, but like you have to kind of keep it on the DL, right? Those are those things. Like the IP laws are actually the things that probably would kill the carry forward of those things, but. Yeah, that's
which also is we need to continue to reform and fight against that. I mean, just topically speaking, this loss that Oracle was thankfully given by Google on the API side was a wonderful example of like that could happen. The other thing is like we need IP reform. First of all, software patents are immoral and should be abolished right away. Secondly, copyright should be restricted back to the original length. If it was like 18 years, right? 18 years of copyright, all these retro games would be in the public domain now, and we wouldn't have to be like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, which, by the way, I don't even wink or nudge. I play ROMs that I download off the fucking internet and sue me.
That's the thing. Everybody does, right? That industry is but again, it's interesting because the sad part is that the utility of being able to download a ROM, because the ROMs are small in comparison to our bandwidth and compute power and all that kind of stuff, now makes it possible. But like, you mentioned PlayStation 3. In another generation, a generation of consoles, like, so we've got PlayStation 5s and Xbox X and stuff like that right now. But like, I would argue that the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 games, those should be easy to download and play now too. And there's a bunch of emulators, but they're so much harder to find than, say, a ROM for Wonder Boy. So
it's. Absolutely. I mean, this is also just the interesting thing is like, we just don't know where this is all gonna go. That's why it's fun to still be a spectator, still fun to be a participant in this. But also I think it's important to be a bit of a pirate. You know what? I fucking downloaded music off Napster because that was the fucking easy thing to do, right? And now I subscribe to Spotify and I pay for it all, right? Like there's some lessons in here of like, you know what, I'd happily pay for some of these ROMs if you just fucking made it easy on a single click and I could get them, right? And you don't, so I don't. But I'm also saying this as a hardened criminal. I used to run a software board before internet and all that
Oh,
stuff with full of pirated software and so on. So,
oh man,
um,
yeah,
anyway, let's not even get into all
yeah,
that.
we might. I'm not sure about the statutory limit on some of those things, but
Yeah, right. Like I got to make sure what crimes I'm actually um,
well, but I
committing to
think
here on.
you're right. You're right though in that we can draw a bright line from Napster one to Spotify. It's actually
Right.
fairly easy,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
And so you can argue that like the utility of those services had to be if they had to exist in the shadows for them to be pulled up to basically be where
Right.
they are today, then it was worth it, right?
Which is
And
sort
I
of,
don't
I
know if
think,
Sean
also a little
Parker
bit.
thinks that, but the rest of us do. So
Which I also think is a little bit of what's happening with ROMs, right? Like retro games, all these like mini consoles that are coming out. Oh,
oh
you can get the
yeah,
mini.
yeah,
I actually
yep,
own all of them. Actually, I don't even think I'm violating any copyright laws. If you rightfully
no,
own all of those consoles,
that's true.
you can actually. There's some fair use there
Yeah,
that you can reuse. Oh, that's
yeah.
wonderful. So now my
Well, like,
conscience is clean. I have both
well,
the
like,
mini Super Nintendo and the mini Mega Drive and the mini
yeah.
Nintendo. So
Oh,
yeah,
so
that's all
nice.
my
Yeah,
ROMs.
I mean, like, I downloaded my yeah, let the lawyers know.
Right.
My 6-year-old loves watching old Mario videos, like people like Mario playthroughs on YouTube. And she really wanted to play them, and I realized like, oh well, like Nintendo made all of those like a huge kitty of those games available on Switch just for free. And again, they
Right.
did that because people were pirating the ROMs anyway, and they're like, well, let's just
Totally.
give them the real versions of them to
Yes.
play on Switch.
Yes.
So yeah, I think
Love
that
it.
again, there's a bright line between those things as well. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk some shop a little bit. So you're all experiencing this on Railsconf.org, and I want to say that our wonderful designer Fred designed the whole thing, and I'm fortunately, unfortunately, mostly the guilty party for the site itself, having basically built it and worked on it for the last couple of months. And so I actually have questions because this is the first time in a while that like I'd written a significant Rails app and I wouldn't even call this significant. So, and I think that other people in the crowd are probably going to have these questions too. So I thought you'd be the perfect person to ask them, right? So we've got Hotwire and Stimulus that have come out recently, and we've got they're kind of putting turbo links a little bit in their rearview mirror, right? Maybe you talk a little bit about sort of what makes them different and why people would choose, for instance, one over another, right? There's a bunch of turbo links apps that are currently going now, or even maybe I'm off base and they're not even related, but I think that people have that question. It might be good to just sort of touch on that briefly.
Yeah, I think we should have done that when we announced Hotwire. Turbolinks has been fully submerged, subsumed, supersetted by
Okay.
Hotwire and by Turbo. Turbo
Oh, good.
Drive, which is one of the three major components of a Turbo, is Turbolinks. We simply just took
Okay.
Turbolinks and then we build more stuff to it. So all the benefits you had in Turbolinks, they live on in Turbo and in Hotwire. So
Okay.
we need to make the upgrade story a little easier because it's actually terribly easy. It's basically just a bunch of events that got renamed from
Mm,
Turbo Links
mm.
colon something to Turbo colon. And we can make a shim for that such that existing applications that are converting from TurboLinks to Turbo can do so without even having to rewrite everything upfront. I mean, not that there's that much to rewrite. We made this translation Turbo originally, as we were building it as part of Hey, was called TurboLinks 6. That was what it was going to be. It was going to be TurboLinks
Okay.
6. And then we
Sure.
just came up with these extra things that weren't TurboLinks. We came up with frames, and we came up with streams. And these were like, oh, they don't fit in. Like, are they TurboLinks streams? What are they? No, actually, they're as important as the links part. So let's build something grander that encompasses all this vision. And then, hey, we also have this stimulus thing. Oh, actually, now we have a grand unified story on how to
Mm,
write the front end with Rails, with a HTML over the wire centric architecture and approach.
sure.
This should be a thing. This should be a whole thing. And part of the reason there too was, I mean, I won't sort of beat around, but I've been a little miffed at the reaction that TurboLinks had gotten. I feel like it was very misunderstood from 2013 to let's say 17, maybe. I forget when Sam Stevenson made a presentation at Railsconf, actually, like maybe 3 years
I
ago,
have to
four
go
years
look.
ago, or something like that, presenting TurboLinks 5. And I feel like that was a moment where sentiments changed.
Hmm.
And I thought, like, they just hadn't changed enough. Like, there's so much good here in the approach and the alternative that this provides to the dominant narrative on how you're supposed to build the front end, that this needs a rebranding, actually. Um, this needs a rebranding. We need to take all these existing good ideas, put them in a new attractive package together with a bunch of other good ideas, and now is this unified approach. And then we need to give it like a poster child, right?
Sure.
Ruby on Rails originally, part of its success in my analysis of 2004 forward was that it wasn't just like a piece of open source that was being distributed, like, hey, check it out and see what you can do with it. No, no, no.
Sure.
It was an extracted piece of open source
Right.
that had an application that could spark some ideas. Oh, you can build something like Basecamp with this. And people
Hmm.
went like, oh, okay, Basecamp is kind of like the thing I'm building because I'm also building an
Yep.
information system. It's not the
Yep.
different. It just caught imagination of so many people. And I
Yep.
think that was what TurboLinks a little bit lacked, because we never had a banner application for TurboLinks. We just put TurboLinks into Basecamp, and people already knew Basecamp, so they weren't giving it a second look. Hey gave Hotwire just an entirely new spin, because here is an application that would probably be the last application you would think of not to be a single page application, right? Literally, I've seen half of the tutorials on like, oh, why you should use a single page application. We'll use them. If you're building something like Gmail, of course you should use a single page application, right? Like, we're like, nope. We're building not something just like Gmail. We're building something that, in my opinion, I mean, reasonable people can differ, but is better than Gmail and
Sure.
does not use a single page application. In fact, when we were doing this benchmarking, I looked into like the amount of JavaScript that Gmail ships. I think at this time point, it's like 3.6 megabytes, something like that. Over, I think, maybe 6 different packages or something like that. I forget what it is, but it's very high, right? The amount of JavaScript we shipped for, hey, 40 kilobytes.
Yeah.
You're just like, that's a different class of thing.
Yeah.
That's just like, we're not graduating like the same thing or stretching it out, or we're like slightly on different ends of the spectrum. No. We're playing a different game. We're
Yeah.
playing a completely different game that comes from this love of HTML as the transport layer, that we don't want to write actually these single page applications. Now, the irony here is that sort of what drives Turbo itself is essentially a single page application in its sort of
Sure.
architecture, right? Like, it keeps a persistent process. It's fast CGI to regular CGI. This is why you
Right.
don't get the teardown. This is where you get some of these speed ups and so on. But from the development perspective,
Right.
it's nothing like that. It really just
Right.
isn't. It is like you wind back the clock to like 2005, and you're like, oh, what if everything was just a request response cycle? And
Yeah.
that just provides you with such a different development experience. The experience that I basically sort of always wanted back, right? Like, I've been,
Sure.
I don't think it's a secret, I've been a fairly reluctant JavaScript programmer over the years. I've written a lot of JavaScript, a lot of app JavaScript and so on, but never been like a deeply enthusiastic person about that endeavor. It was just, this is what I have to do. This
Yeah.
is what you have to do to make these kinds of applications. So to unleash that and dig out from underneath it and get to a point where like you don't actually have to do that, or you have to do it
Sure.
in a completely different quantity than what you did before, right? That we can
Yep.
end up with, hey, and like it's 40K with the fucking libraries included. Jesus. Like, that's
Yeah.
totally
Yeah. I
different.
mean, I always, like thinking about, think back to remember the Gmail launch day when like everybody finally got access to it, and we're like, oh my, this is a website?
Right.
Like,
Yes.
like everybody kind of lost their collective minds for about a month. And I've thought about it over time because it's such an interesting perspective on, for instance, Hey's perspective versus Gmail's perspective. And I think of Gmail as an old Win32 app, right? An old Win32 apps, you basically didn't have much in terms of actual displays. You were basically like, I want to make a widget and I want to do a thing and I have to write tons of code in order to make each individual widget. When I click a button, I want to like go pull that button and I want to basically tear down that button and I want to redraw it over here. And
Yes.
they were so hard to write because there was you didn't have any help. right?
Right.
And the choice for Gmail was like, let's write a Win32 app, but in JavaScript using HTML to render everything. Whereas the comparison here would basically be like, you look at something like an iOS app, right? And where or something that uses all of the tools that are available in that ecosystem to basically be like, no, actually, I want to have a thing, and when you click on a thing, I just want you to let me know over here. I don't want to have to implement all of the view, all of that thing, and I just want to have each individual component be separately to basically be able to handle them themselves. And so they're much easier to understand, for instance, in that
Right.
case, right? That was always the kind of architecturally difference between those sort of two ecosystems about how to architect an app.
I think that that was one of the things that I never liked about the single page application work that I did. Is just in some ways it's kind of like what fits the brain, like with Ruby, right? I'll talk to Python developers and they'd be like super enthusiastic, happy Python developers or
Mhm.
Go developers or whatever, right? And you're like,
Sure.
I can see why you're happy. The language fits your brain. Like that's how you
Yeah.
think. It's almost like a learning style, right?
Mhm.
And that's how I feel about Ruby. And why wouldn't the same be true on the web? Why wouldn't there
Yeah.
be different approaches and styles to it that fit certain brain types away? And some people like they apparently think in JavaScript, right? And they think about in event bubbling and they think
Yeah.
about statement management and they like all
Yep.
those things and it makes them happy. And I look at all that shit and go like, do you know what? I'm not sure I want to be a developer anymore. So like it's different things that appeal to different people. And that was what
Yep.
was so tragic to me about what's happened over the past, let's say 10, 12 years in web development is it became so monocultural in terms of like how are you supposed to build a web app, right? Or you're supposed
Mhm.
to make a server thing, and then you're supposed to send JSON over the server. You're supposed to send this React thing or React like or Vue or
Yep.
whatever, right? And like it was a, okay, there are differences, like there are different frameworks. You can do React, you can do Vue, you can do whatever, right? But they're all within the same paradigm. We need different paradigms, just like we need object-oriented programming, just like we need
Yes.
functional programming, just like we need procedural programming. There are different paradigms that appeal to different, I want to say brain types. I don't know if that's actually how the neuroscience maps out, but at least proclivities and things that kind of map to it. Because my entire career as a developer, I owe to discovering Ruby and discovering Ruby being like, do you know what? This is my language. And it just set me on such a different path, which also explains so much of the online controversy around Hotwire, right? Because there's some people who instantly go, yes, I don't have to fucking write that monstrosity in React anymore.
Right.
Hallelujah, right? Like things are so much better now. And then there are other people going like, what even is this? This is just a
Yeah.
reinventation of some ASP thing I once saw 15 years ago. And like, this is how my mental modeling and boxing of this works, right? I can't even comprehend why people would do it. That to me
Yeah.
tells me everything that this is about paradigm shifts, right? Much the same as we see it with object orientation versus functional programming. There's
Yeah.
some people who just go like, object orientation is just stupid. State is just stupid, right? Like if everything's just a pure function and everything is a monad, like the world just makes sense. And I just go like, um, nope, it makes no, that does not make sense to me, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's much. I mean, I feel this about. I remember one time sitting down and thinking, do you know what? Lisp is an important sort of computer language. I should learn some Lisp. And
Yeah.
like literally after 30 minutes, I couldn't do it. I'm like, I was trying really hard. I was sitting down, like, all right, I'm gonna
Yeah.
learn the basics of Lisp. It's programming, right? It's fucking programming.
Yeah.
It's meta
Yeah.
programming. It's got all these other things. Like, I can do this. And I'm like, no, fuck, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I mean, what a tragedy it would be if someone shows up and they're like, hey, I want to be the web developer. I want to develop for the web. And then they sit down and like, all right, I'm going to learn myself some React here. And then they just go like, fuck it. Web development is not for me.
Yeah. So I have been on and off. I've been sort of like made myself available to computer science students, or not even computer science students, who are looking to get an industry, specifically at my old university. And I had a really great conversation. You'll see where I'm going with this in a second. I had this really great conversation with this one individual who is currently an art history major. And they're like, hey, like I actually did an internship in computer programming and I really like it. And could you tell me a little bit about more how I could break into it? Because like I'm still going to graduate. I'm far enough along. I'm still going to have an art history degree. I'm not probably going to get a CS degree, but I probably want to be doing programming in some way. And so I was like, okay, great. So there's the camp that I kind of told him, which is that like, look, programming is itself a trade skill, right? So like, yeah, you can go to school for it, but and you will miss a few things, and I'll just tell you the things that people miss. Like for instance, just read up on big O notation and a couple of other minor things. Otherwise, everybody else is just learning a different trade. Oh, I'm learning React, I'm doing whatever. We're all in the same boat. You're basically learning a trade. But I think that the interesting point where programming crosses over into this other academic-ish field is, it's not really academic either, is it's not engineering, strict engineering either. Well, strict engineering also has to do with aesthetics, but there's so much aesthetics in programming as well. In the same way, it's more like literature. It's like, yeah, like, like some people might really like true crime, some people might really like fantasy, and those two people can read books. And if the only books that were available were true crime, those fantasy people would be so upset. They're like, I guess I can't read now. It's like, what
Bingo.
a loss that would be.
Totally. Yeah, this is the framing I had, I think in like 2014 or something, about for me programming being writing, not engineering, right? I'll
Oh yeah.
occasionally put on an engineering hat because like that's the
Yep.
thing you need to do when you do experiments and you need to control your variables and you need to do performance
Yep.
testing and you need to do all this stuff. And that's like 2% of what I do. And
Yep.
for some other people, it's 80% of what they do or 100% of what they do. But for me, the 98% is the writing part, right? Like that's really what inspired me and lit my flame with Ruby, was that it was just such a pure writing environment. It's much the same, or in some ways, it's the same on a more superficial level. Why I like IA Writer, which is a simple
Mm-hmm.
writing
Mm-hmm.
tool, which is like,
Yeah.
it's just this gray canvas and it's got just the right font and like the cursor blinks in just the right way. It's a lot about aesthetics, which even that
Yeah.
word itself at least used to be controversial. I remember when I talked about like
Sure.
aesthetics in
I
Ruby, and there were a lot
I
of
remember.
programmers who
Yeah.
were like, what the fuck are you talking about? Aesthetics do not matter. Like it's runtime complexity and it's like memory usage and it's all these other things. Like aesthetics is for a different kind of people, and we're not those people, right? And I said, like, that's so silly, right? Like, in
Yeah.
fact, it was what turned me off from being a programmer for so long. I mean, I grew up loving computer games, thought I wanted to make computer games. Then I realized what coding for computer games looks like. And I realized, oh, shit, that's not me at all. That's fucking all math and vectors and all
Writing with
this stuff,
32
right?
apps.
Do you know what's funny? I just tried, actually, I didn't try. I thought one more time, sort of nostalgically, a few weeks ago. Do you know what? I used to love the Amiga. I wonder actually what writing
Yeah.
games for the Amiga was like. And I sat through this 6 course thing on YouTube about
Yeah.
assembler programming. And I was like, do you know what? I could do this. And I'm like, registers, and it's got these things, and you use the blitter and you use the copper. And I was like, at the end of it, it was just like, I love games. I just don't want to make them. So
Yeah.
when I was sort of growing up, I thought that is programming. That's the thing. Like
Yeah.
that's the box, and that's programming. That's what you do. And it wasn't until discovering the web and information systems and ultimately Ruby where I realized, you know what? There are other kinds of programming. And like I'm really good at some of the other kinds. I totally suck at the blitter, copper, register, assembler kind. Like right, I
Yeah.
just can't do it.
Yeah.
Can't do Lisp either. I can do Ruby.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's interesting is, so my mother is a writer. She's written. She started off when I was young. Started writing murder mysteries, and she's since written a lot of different kinds of things. But it's always been interesting to me to have exposure to somebody who's like she would just be like, she'd always be working on a book or something like that. And it's like, oh yeah, like what does she write? Oh, she writes this sort of work. So having exposure to the idea that like, yeah, you write these books and some people like them and some people don't, I think gave me this very specific, nuanced understanding, or I thought understanding of aesthetics. It's just that, like, yeah, some people like stuff and some other people don't like stuff. And so,
Right.
like, to this day, I think when I have programming, I've been to some, like, I went to, when I was working on Rubinius, I went to a summit with a bunch of other languages that we're all going to talk about how to make cool JITs and all that kind of stuff. And I think somebody asked me like, "Oh, is it going to be confrontational? Like, oh, you've got the Python people and the Ruby people." I was like, I don't know. I'm just going to go hang out with them. Like to me, the difference between the programming languages is, again, sort of like what kind of movies do you like? I'm not going to get down on people who like movies that I don't particularly like. That's fine. There's a lot of movies out there, right?
Right.
So yeah.
It's funny that is one of the things that is an acquired skill for me. I think when I started with Ruby on Rails, Ruby had been such a bright light for me such a revelation, such a different path that I just went like, do you know what? It is a damn travesty that there are 43 people at this Ruby conference at a hotel in, I think, Arizona in 2003. The world needs to know about this, right? So I sort of took on a role as in highly antagonistic fashion, let's just cop to it as it is, to evangelize Ruby in a confrontational manner, not just as like, hey, this is also another church you could do. It's just like another thing. Whereas like, hey, Java programmers, look at this shit. Right? Look at this shit. Look at your code. Like it's all this code. And like, boom, now it's just this code. Then what, huh? Then what? And I think that has been something I've had to kind of like, I don't know, grow out of to the point, and perhaps it's easier to grow out of it now that Ruby is this self-maintaining
Sure.
universe that doesn't actually need more programmers per se to do what it needs to do. It should attract them because they want to be here, right?
Right.
And then getting to the point of like, do you know what? It would suck if everyone started to use Ruby. I would fucking hate it. And nothing has given me more that than JavaScript, because everyone kind of had to write JavaScript, right? And that meant that the ecosystem was so broad as to be not super coherent, in my opinion, in the way that Ruby is a very coherent ecosystem, right? Like, of course, there's differences and we have different ways of doing things, but there's just a shared aesthetic mostly.
Yeah.
There's some broad tendencies here of cohesion to, I think, almost like on a societal level that I find like, do you know what? That's good. It's not good. Not everyone should be part of this community. In fact, it gains its strength from being just one of several options that you can choose. But for the person where Ruby is the right thing for them, it is so damn right for them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump into another topic. I have written down here, and we can approach this however you'd like. The way I wrote it down was Apple v. Hey v. Epic ? So, like, I don't know. It started off, I think, maybe a month after the Hey launch, or a couple. No, it was basically at that same point in time, and it's gone through its ebbs and flows over time. I don't know that I really want to have us do a synopsis of it. Maybe just to say, like, how are you feeling about that whole situation? Again, that doesn't have to be even specifically about Hay's status, but all the sort of app stores and that bailiwick all in together.
Well, I'll give you the big picture briefly, and then I'll dive into the small picture, which I think is more interesting for us. For me, the big picture is this is the Titanic fight of the century, the fight against concentrated power and money, and monopolies. Tech monopolies are the sort of frontier of that. Like monopolization across the entire economy is a huge fucking problem, and big tech monopolies are the worst of the bunch in terms of their size and so on. Literally the biggest companies, not just in the US, but in the world, are tech monopolies. And they are slowly squeezing the life out of people at the edges, right? While still providing products that people enjoy. And this is why this isn't the same clear-cut case, perhaps in some regards, that you could imagine that, like, I don't know, railroads or tobacco or other things were. But I think it's going to be that. And this is something I've invested a lot of my personal time and social capital in raising the stature of this fight, because I was vaguely aware of it, or not even vaguely. I was pretty aware of it. I've followed the industry quite closely over a long period of time, developed on both sides of the fences with native and published in the app stores and all of a sudden. But to realize in which ways the game has changed, particularly in the last couple of years, is really stark. And I can totally extrapolate a vision where these MacBooks that we're all sitting on, right? You don't get to write your own software for that anymore. It becomes a version of iOS, and we're halfway there with signing and so on. And all of these things have sort of perfectly fine sounding safety arguments. Oh, if you have signing, and then you can kick things off. But you know what? Why I got into computers, why I'm interested in computers, is like this was a device for me to manifest something that I wanted to exist. Not fucking ask permission. Like, the only permission I had to ask was like, can the copper do this? Can the blitter do this? Not like, hey, Commodore, can I invoke this register over here? Fuck no, right? Like, that's not a thing. It's the same thing with the web. This is why I'm so passionate about both the web and email, These are these kind of open platforms that seem almost inconceivable, or not almost. To me, they seem inconceivable. They would not happen today, right? Why wouldn't
Yep.
they happen? Because today we have platforms. And
Yeah.
with platforms, we get monopolies. And with monopolies, we get monopolists. And with monopolists, we get this concentration of power and the distortion of everything. Not just, I mean, what I sort of naively thought like, oh, we get a distortion of like developer dynamics and so on. No, we also get a distortion of the economy. And once you get a distortion of that, you get a distortion of fucking democracy. I've literally testified in front of several state houses and senates in the past several months about this topic.
I saw the one that you were doing in Texas. Yeah.
Yes, in Arizona.
Or
And
in Arizona. Yeah.
to see corruption that close up front, where you're literally talking to someone who's reading off a sort of a talking point sheet from one of the big tech companies, you're just like, holy fuck. You're like, oh man, this is even worse than I thought, and I thought it was pretty bad. So that's sort of kind of what animates me about this, is that like,
Yeah.
access to markets, as some put it, is like, that's worth fighting for. This idea that you can publish on the internet without asking anyone's fucking permission is a key aspect of like why I'm an entrepreneur in the first place, why I even continue to bother do this stuff. Like, this is what I derive so much of my passion and interest in continuing on to do this, right? Why am I still fucking writing code 20 years later? Like, I don't have to do this. I could do other things. I could fucking play video games all day long, or do something else. No, I do it because of this, right? I don't have to ask anyone for permission. I can go out and do it. And what's interesting about it is that like, I'm complicit in this too, right? Like, I was a fucking Apple booster for the longest time. I did a fucking ad for Apple in 2004. Jason and I voluntarily, without getting paid, participated in a advertisement for Apple that's still on YouTube, and you can find it and laugh hysterically at how embarrassing we looked and sounded.
We'll put
at
it
that
in
time.
Discord later.
Right. So like, it's not like I kind of I had such a admiration for Apple, and still do in many ways, like product development and so forth. But ultimate power just corrupts ultimately. And you're like, we gotta tease that apart, and we gotta tease it apart for all these reasons of like, the experience I had being a developer, making things for the web, has gotten eroded. It's not just as simple, because it's not about difficulty or complexity. It's not as free in sort of the most literal, high-minded sense of the word to make software today as it was 10 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, you could make software just for the web, and you didn't have to ask anyone's permission, and you could just put it out there. And you know what? If we had tried to launch Hey that way last summer, no one would have heard of us. It wouldn't have registered. A mainstream email service like Hey needs to be where people do their computing. And for a lot of people, they do their computing on their pocket computers. And the access to those pocket computers goes through these abusive monopolists. And I think that's just, it's really hard to swallow that when you've known the before times, right? If you've grown up in the after times, if you're, hey, I'm a digital developer, I showed up, I started learning development like 4 years ago, like, these ecosystems and platforms, they were always part of your consciousness, right? Like, it's sort of like in the same ways that languages can open your mind by allowing you to express new concepts and ideas in ways you didn't know were possible before. It's why people read philosophers in their native languages, because you can say certain things in German or in Danish that just do not have literal translations that mean the same things, right? And there's something to that, to having grown up in the before times. The before times being where you could just publish software to the internet, or a larger slice of the potential software you could publish could just go straight to the internet, and you were kind of in control of that. And it's like, we can't give that up. We cannot give that up.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting, I think about my kids, and I think about them being like, oh, like it'd be fun to write a game, or it'd be fun to do this kind of stuff. Like, they play a lot of Minecraft and do a lot of stuff inside there, and I could see the kernel and the like, oh, well, how would I make a thing that runs on the iPad? It's like, okay, well, now I got to get into a whole nother thing, right? And I think that interesting. You're totally right in that it's bad now, but it's not irrevocably bad to the point where it's like, oh, it has to be, we just have to start all over, right? It's like, it's not to the point where it's like, okay, like we got to just ditch everything and have some, go back to when trying to put Linux on the desktop again, or whatever it is, right? We're not at that point yet, but I think you're right in that the movement in that direction is pretty clear. And like I have actually thought for a while, like, okay, like I switched over to the titanium PowerBook. Remember the titanium PowerBook? Which I lusted after the titanium PowerBook because I was a college student at the time and I could not afford it under no terms, right? I ended up getting the first white iBook. I think it was,
On
or
the
I
same
can't remember
trajectory,
what the
man.
yeah,
Yes.
and those early days, right? It was like, oh, okay, great. I've been there the whole time, and I have thought to myself, like, okay, I feel like the trajectory is such that it's like, are they going to take away the ability to I think the signing thing in Big Sur is like they almost don't want me to distribute my own code to
Right.
run on another machine anymore. Like
Yes.
we're just like the hair's breadth away from that. And at which
Right.
point it's like, oh, maybe what am I going to write my weird programs on now, right? And that's the saddest thing in the world. So
It is, and it connects. Apple has this, or had this advertisement for the iPads, right? You have this little girl laying
yeah,
in the grass,
yeah,
and she's like, "What's a computer?" And you're like, they
yeah,
meant that as a positive, and I just went like, "Holy fucking!" You just showed me
yeah,
dystopia, right? That people will
yeah,
grow up and they will not know what computers are because computers are not something that normal people are allowed to operate. They're allowed
right.
to operate, and I mean, we're about two spits away from being on a full free software march here.
We're real close. I'll rein us in. I'll rein
Which
us
in
in.
itself, I think actually has been a revelation to me because so many of these topics I thought were like they were overstated or they were like, no, in some ways they were just prophetic, right? Like we weren't there yet. And I feel like in that same role now, right? Like we're so much further along there, but I have conversations with people all the time, often on Twitter to my own detriment. We're just like, they just cannot see it at all, right? Like, no, no, this is all great. This is all good. You're like, can you just look at what's happened the last 10 years, then extrapolate another 10 years on the same trajectory into the future? And like, who's going to look at that and think like, yeah, that's a place I want to be? I mean,
Yeah,
particularly for us programmers, right? Like, is that the
yeah,
place where you want to be, where like computers are no longer something you're sort of allowed to tinker with yourself? Um,
yeah.
it's just, but I was going to say it's depressing, but it's not depressing. It's actually hopeful because it does feel like there is a standstill to be had, right? Like without getting all fucking Braveheart on it, I'm thinking that there's some like, do you want to lay in your bed all these years from now, knowing there is one left? I mean, I don't know why I'm using a fucking
That was
Kennedy
good. I
voice
good.
to narrate Bruce
I
Wallace
love the
here.
Danish accent to English back to Scottish. That was just mwah.
Right. And that is a little bit what you feel. Obviously you got to be careful with this, and sometimes I overstep the line and you become overly righteous and you become wrapped up in a cause and you lose sight of the whatever the trees. But hopefully you continue to see
Sure.
the forest here and you see this is worth fighting for. This is worth taking a
Yeah.
stand for.
Yeah.
And I just, I mean, even if it is going to be for naught, right? And like odds are, let's be fair, it is. Like usually money and power wins. Like, that's not a controversial statement. That's just a
No.
statement of historical fact. That is
Yeah.
usually what happens. But you know what? Just once in a while, it doesn't. Just
Yeah.
once in a while, the trajectory has changed. And you go like, wow, how the fuck did that happen? Right? Like, how did
Yeah.
we were on such a stark authoritarian angle here, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden it crashed. And like,
Yeah.
I don't want to sit back and think like, you know what? I should have said something. Do you know what? I
Right.
could have said something. I had a platform. There were people who followed me where if I said something, maybe there were others who were like, oh, you know what? I'm going to look into that myself. I'm not just going to take your statement for sort of kosher,
Yep.
right? Like I'm going to look into it. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to make up my mind. And enough people are going to make up their mind and they're going to go like, you know what? This isn't right. No.
Yeah.
And change is going to happen, right? I'd give it low
Yeah.
odds. And I think better than not, like we're going to sit here 10 years from now thinking like, do you remember computers when you could just like, you could just write your own programs and like, you didn't even have to call up Apple Siri and ask whether you were allowed. Like that was the times, wasn't it? Like,
We'll do this with Apple VR glasses in an Apple car or something like
right.
that in 10 years. But no, I mean, you're not wrong in that those moments when things go a direction that were unexpected are seeded by something in the past, right?
Right.
That's the difference, right? Is that there's there's a really big train and it's moving down the track, but those little bits of time, those conversations, those talking to people, using, if you
Yes,
think it's important, using your voice, even if you don't think it's important, you don't really understand. No one really knows their impact, right? And
right.
you can't really measure the impact until it's far enough along to say, like, I don't know if I did that, but I'm glad that the outcome was, or at least that I tried, yeah, in
Be the
whichever way.
fucking
Yeah,
butterfly flapping its wings in
yeah,
Denmark that causes rain in Sao
yeah,
Paulo.
exactly. Yeah,
Yes,
we're not. Yeah, it's just too complicated for us to
right.
understand, which means that you should try rather than not try because you don't understand it, right? That's the I
Which
think
which
that's the thing.
to me, on a personal level, on sort of almost like a psychological sense defense level, this is also a way to retain hope. That the way to
Yeah,
fight
it is.
despair
Yeah,
is action, right?
yeah,
And I
yes,
mean, even if that action has low odds and probably is not going to turn out, like it is a way
yeah.
to starve off the despair for at least some time longer.
So
On
true.
that happy note,
On that happy note, all right, I'm gonna go see if I can find. Okay, I found a view in Discord where I can look at questions. While I'm looking at questions, do you have anything you wanna? All right. Do you want an F1 question?
an F1 question.
Yeah.
I kind of just saw like someone was like, "What the fucking keynote?" I feel like we should talk about Rails 7 for at least 5 seconds.
Okay, let's talk about Rail 7. Fair enough.
Okay.
Fair enough. What's going on with Rail 7? I'll be honest. I went to go refresh my memory, and I went to the Edge docs, and it was like Rail 7 has coming soon, coming soon, coming soon. I was like, okay. Uh, so yeah, I mean, like, what do you think is going to be the big things? Have you thought about it? Any ideas? That kind of stuff.
Yes. So for me, the thing I'm most excited about is something that's still sort of undetermined, um, which is how far can we push Hotwire? Um, and most importantly, how far can we push Hotwire without um, Webpack? Can we get to a place? Is there a place? Is there an opening here where developing modern web applications do not require transpiling, do not require bundling, do not require all the complexity that is involved with having node modules be part of your Rails app? I believe there is. It's a hypothesis at this point. I think like directionally that's absolutely correct. Whether the timing is 100% there is a little uncertain, but I think that this is where this is where it's going to go. I was just
Mm, mm,
I just tweeted I was
that's
playing
interesting.
around with some PaaS platforms as a service things where like,
Hmm.
hey, Heroku and there's something called Render and there's a bunch in the EU and I got some great
Yep.
recommendations. And I was like, I just wanted to feel like what does it feel like again to set that up and work with and start with a new fresh app where I don't have like the luxury of the awesome Basecamp ops team and all these other things
Sure.
in my
Yeah. Yeah.
back,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things that I kind of like, do you know what? I don't want to fuck around with Node. Like I don't want to fuck around with Webpack setups. Like what I want in most of the things I can imagine that I would want to build is quite simple. I want Hotwire. That is, I want turbo and I can get like 80% of what I want from there. And then I want stimulus and then I want a few extras added into it. I think we can get there. I think a Chrome just shipped something called import maps as a native feature
Hmm.
that allows you to
Yep.
essentially refer, to use the browser as your packaging system, right? You can
Yeah.
reference things and so forth. It's just terribly exciting. And I feel like that's the next frontier where we can really finally answered the question, oh, what should you use? Should you use the asset pipeline? Should you use Webpack? Like get to
Yep.
some conclusions there that provide us like, okay, this is it. Not that this is it for everyone, right? Like as Rails has
Hmm.
always had, it's omakase, but you can substitute as you please.
Yep.
But the omakase menu is very clear that like there's a path here that does not require Node, not requiring Node modules, any of that complexity. And you can make wonderful, amazing apps with it. We're in the process of investigating whether we can do that switch for Hey. And I think that this is
Hmm.
one of those big thresholds. If we can get
Yep.
Hey on essentially a unbundled JavaScript world,
Yep.
there's a lot of apps that can go there, right? So I think I want to
Yeah.
push that frontier. I'm really interested in pushing that frontier into Rails 7. Just at the baseline, what obviously is going to happen, TurboLinks is out, Hotwire's in, again as an optional thing, and you can choose still to use Webpack and so on. And we're going to
Sure.
put some of these other extractions we've taken out of Hey into it. Active record encryption is something I'm obviously very proud of the work that we've done there. It
Hmm.
feels like it's the kind of thing that we should be doing. I've always been big on these nudges, right? Like right from Rails Premiere, you're like, we're generating test stubs for you. You're like,
Yeah.
I don't do unit testing. What are these unit tests doing in here? And you might go open one of them and you're like, oh, I guess I can try some of it.
Put some code in there. Yeah.
Exactly. Run a bunch of code and just hit go. And there you are. You actually fucking have automated testing for your systems, right? If we can get there with some of these other best practices, hey, do you know what? You probably shouldn't store a lot of sensitive data in plain text. Someone gets access to your database, they have access to all the data in it. No, that wouldn't be great, right? And yet that is the standard. Like what we're doing with Hey, where we have per row encryption and so on, that is not the norm because it used to be really difficult. Could we make it so easy it could be the default? That really is what fascinates me because it goes into this whole idea of conceptual compression, right? Like, hey, I don't have to be an encryption expert to use encryption as part of my work. Everyone who uses Rails today uses encryption as part of their work. Their sessions use asynchronous encryption, right? And by the way, the session one is a good example. Like we store the session now in a cookie. It hasn't been controversial for a long time. When it first appeared, it was very controversial. Like, what do you mean you're going to put sensitive information into a cookie that is stored on someone else's machine? And then you go like, you know what? Oh, actually, encryption allows new ways of storage where you're not afraid anymore that the payload ends up in someone else's hand. This is why we use the internet. This is why we can use SSL, all these other good things, right? Yep. We can get further of that into how we build applications in more levels. One of the other things I've long wanted to do more of is incineration, right? I keep referring back to this tweet. I don't know if he thinks this is good. This tweet that was like, no one actually deletes data anymore. They just mark it as deleted in the database.
Deleted, yeah.
Right. This was one of those horror statements for me, right? As someone like, do you know what? Shit, so all my data I've ever put out on the internet still exists in all these databases just with a deleted flag? Fuck. That's no. That's not how we should be doing things. If I fucking delete shit, it should be eventually gone. Right. And we build up this whole regime at Basecamp and at Hey, where like things are actually getting stripped out. And like we're not storing our database backups 8 years in the past. Like after 30 days, it is fucking gone. And can we put more of that again into these things, these patterns become defaults? That would be great. So this is some of the things that inspires me about Rails 7. But I think for me, the first thing is can we get to a cohesive button down story on the front end? Can we really double down on Hotwire without the node assisted way of setting it up? If we can, I think it's going to be a monumental win for just even, I read sometimes through these like onboarding things. Oh, I'm just learning Rails. Like, and then you go like 5 minutes and like, oh, and here, now you have to learn everything there is to know about fucking Node and JavaScript and Webpack and bundling and transpiling and Babel. And like, you're like, this is accidental complexity, right? I do not need to understand the history of fucking JavaScript development to just put a form online that takes fields and puts them in the database.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I can't wait to see. I mean, like we will probably release the source code for Railsconf.org, and you will see me not using any asset pipeline and including JavaScript right in the page because I was like, I literally have a 3-week timeline. I do not want to go learn how to use Webpack and use the asset pipeline in that time frame, and so I just didn't bother. Right. Well, we're basically out of time. I always think that how are we going to fill the time, and then we're always right up against the end of it. Thanks so much, David, for your time and for all of your work and your thoughts and everything. You're going to stick around on Discord a little bit, I think, and we'll be around. And it's so great talking to you. And we'll see you all around soon.
Likewise, absolutely. Enjoy the rest of Railsconf.